Good morning. Welcome to the Facebook Live series Straight Off the Bat, a show that covers the need to revive, survive, and adapt to the new normal. Join us as we will be speaking to individuals across the financial industry who will help you understand financial literacy and education. I'm your host, Pauline Joseph, and today's conversation is near and dear to my heart. And I can't wait to ask our guest a barrage of questions. Our guest today is Dr. Gabrielle Hosein, and she is the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies in the St. Augustine campus. Today, we're going to have a little discussion around gender. We recently celebrated International Women's Day, and I was so elated to see the conversations trending around the idea to choose to challenge. And you may be wondering, what is this about money? Why is this even on Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago? Hold that thought. Wait a minute. I'm going to answer that with all the questions, because all of these things connect the dots in terms of being a female in the workplace, looking at the discussion around what it means to have maternity leave, all these things we want to be able to ask Dr. Hosein. But before we get there, make sure to smash that follow button, because we do these live sessions very often and we love to hear your feedback. Even though you may be watching it on the replay, that's okay. Comment below, let us know. So I'm going to bring in Dr. Hosein. Here we go. Welcome. Thank you so much for saying yes to sharing your time with us. I know we only have an hour, but I think we are going to try to compact as much information as possible, because I love to have people who are smarter than me in this session. So just to get some insight, can you give us a little background into your facility? What do you do at University of West Indies?
Sure. Good morning, Pauline, and good morning to your viewers, and good morning to the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. For me, it's a pleasure to always connect with communities that I'm not normally in conversation with, and so it's a real privilege for me to be in this space with you all. The Institute for Gender and Development Studies is a university department. We're actually 27 years, more than 27 years old. We are located on all the campuses of the University of the West Indies, in Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. And we're a cross-disciplinary institute, feminist institute of the Global South, that does policy, advocacy, activism, movement building, teaching, research, mentorship, and is, I think, a really strong product of the Caribbean, and a strong representative of the link between, you know, between scholarship and critical thought and social movement building.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a lot of questions in that space,
Go for
but
it.
before I do, I want to ask a little bit about your position as a vice chair of the Equal Opportunities Commission. Could you shed some light on what that means? What does that actually entail?
So I've only been on the Equal Opportunity Commission since October, and although that seems like a long time, it takes a while to get to understand, how to think strategically about a new space and what it can offer. And I was really inspired by the leadership of Lynette Seabaran Sweet, past EOC chair, who really engaged the EOC in its public education component in terms of the way that it can expand the public dialogue around protection from discrimination. And what inspired me, to agree to join the EOC was my interest in creating a national space that is defined by non-discrimination for all persons, not just regarding their race or ethnicity or their sex or their creed, but also disability, age, health status, and sexual orientation. And so I am invested in a world in which we all feel like we belong, we all feel respected, loved, and given equal opportunity. And so the EOC is a space for me to learn and to help mobilize how to best do that.
Great. I want to start off baseline a frank discussion, because there are a lot of people out there that think, why do we have to have an International Women's Day? The running
Yes.
joke is, why
Why
is
not
there
a
not
man
a
day?
man? But the fact that you know what that is, it proves my point. So, what would you say to that person that brings up that
Yeah.
point?
So I'm glad to have this discussion. Everybody has an opinion about gender because we all live it and we all experience it. And so people wonder, well, why do you need an expert? We all have opinions and all our opinions are valid and so on. But you really can be an expert in a field and really understand the conceptual connections that lead to things that often we wonder, well, why is this happening? But in fact, it has a really strong historical and a really a political base. So International Women's Day actually began more than 100 years ago, and it was led by women workers. And for me, that is so powerful. Working class women organizing around issues that affect them. And as the Bankers Association knows, there are strong bankers unions. Many women in the women's movement have also been stewards in the union movement for the Bank and General Workers Union and so on. And so they are actually walking in the tradition of women workers helping to organize around labor issues, around economic justice, around and the intersection of labor issues with women's rights. And so these were factory women who began to organize. And Trinidad has a long history of women organizing in housewives unions, factory unions, all kinds of things. And so that's the tradition that we walk in. It's a very important tradition for every man and woman in Trinidad and Tobago. And International Women's Day was first celebrated in Trinidad and Tobago in 1958 in San Fernando, for those of you from South, and was led by a woman called Christina Lewis. And so it's important for us, in the Caribbean, or in the world, we have an idea that changes happen. So we'll use a phrase like, well, things changed, but things don't change. People change things. So all the rights that we have, all the legislation that has been passed, somebody advocated for that, fought for it for years, secured it, made sure that people knew their rights and could have those rights defended. And so International Women's Day is to commemorate that history of women making change, not just change happening. And in fact, there is an International Men's Day, and that was a day that was actually started by, or is named after, or it's commemorated on the birthday of Jerome Tiluxing's father. He's a university lecturer. And its roots were in identifying a day when men's investments in gender equality, in ending patriarchal and not just patriarchal, but racist, ableist, all the kinds of injustices. It's a day that is commemorating, in a sense, men's contributions to ending injustice and creating a more equal world. And so there is that day, but in the end, whether or not there is a Women's Day or a Men's Day, as human beings, as citizens of the world, as parents, grandparents, family, to children, we should all just be invested in making the world the kindest, most peaceful, most enabling place it can be.
And you are way more eloquent in your response, because I would be like, every day is a man's day.
One could say that, but the thing about men is that men, we live in a patriarchy, obviously, where those qualities and characteristics associated with dominant masculinity carry higher status, value, and power, and where men do remain dominant in politics, in business, in religion, in notions of the family, and so on. But not all men benefit equally from that privileged status. And so there are many men, whether by class, by race, by age, by disability, by gender identity, by sexual orientation, and so on, who do not experience patriarchal power to the same extent. And so men come to an understanding of patriarchy and its inequalities from very different places. And so we, kind of off the cut answers, which are absolutely correct. Every day is a day that there is, every day is a day in which men hold more power than women everywhere in the world, and in which that is absolutely unjust. But we do need to engage in the conversations in ways that make the connections for both women and men, so that we are not speaking at each other, but with each other.
Great. So, if you're just joining us, we're here to discuss the Choose to Challenge conversation around cultural norms. And I want to sort of give us, for those who are watching this live and maybe on a replay, sort of a storyline, because a lot of things we take for granted that we inherit from our parents and don't necessarily question. So there are a lot of cultural norms that we have that maybe you could identify one or two that affects the workplace that we're in today.
Sure. So I want to take a second to talk about violence. I think we don't want to reduce International Women's Day to just to focus on violence at all. International Women's Day, as I said, is a day to celebrate women's struggles, women's achievements, and to be real with ourselves about the challenges that remain. But just to stop for a second around violence. So we know that in Trinidad and Tobago, that 1/3 of women who work in the private sector have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence at the hands of their partner in their lifetime, right? And that violence is not just physical, it includes sexual violence, which is something we don't talk as much as we need to. We don't talk about as much as we need to in Trinidad and Tobago. Those 1/3 of women in the workforce who have experienced, in the private sector in particular, who have experienced violence at some point in their lifetime from their partner, they also experience higher levels of mental distress at work, markedly higher levels of mental distress at work. They experience higher levels of bodily pain, like just an inability to function. Their concentration is affected, as is their self-confidence. And so we know that violence and the experience of it affects women's productivity, and it affects workplaces and workplace productivity. And one of the things that occurred to me, it was very late at night in December of 2017, and I was reading the report on this data in my office. And one of the things that occurred to me is that we talk about productivity so much in Trinidad and Tobago and how low productivity is. And yet we don't think about tackling and we attribute low productivity to poor bureaucratic processes and procedures. But we don't often think about what's going on with the workers that could be tackled, that could then raise productivity. And so I began to talk about the need for a private sector strategy to address violence, taking into account how many women workers it affects across the country, and the effects that we know that it has on their ability to not just be productive, but to succeed and to advance, and to be confident, and have the and and to be freed of the trauma that could be holding them back from doing so. And so that's one issue that I think is a clear workplace issue that helps us all see the necessity for ending violence against women, as it eventually comes to affect us everywhere in the nation, including in our workplaces.
So let's shift the conversation a bit around the world that we're living in right now, right? Because we're under lockdown. We're forced to have this discussion in two different places in Trinidad, and my mother had 6 children. Bless her heart. Don't know how she did it.
Wow. I admire mothers. I have one, and I just want to put on record for any woman listening that I admire mothers for staying sane, for being good people. I admire you. That's all.
co-signed because I obviously, as a teenager growing up, I did not value that. I was like, I hate you. I had my moments. But you know, that was a different world. I literally have so many cuts and running around with my brothers. Thankfully, I had them. But now we're living in a world where a mother, and you know, you could speak on that a little bit more in terms of single mothers in Trinidad, have to balance not just work but your children at home. You know, what type of advice or notes that we should take when it comes to managing somebody who has to have all that stress put on them? Because some people who may not necessarily have parents, I mean, it's not parents, sorry, who don't have kids, may be like, it can't be that big of a deal, you know, they're home and they're on their computer. But I have a cat and that's stressful enough. So,
I think people who don't have kids, and certainly women, have the right to choose, right? I don't think women should be pressed into having children, but I think people who don't have kids know exactly why they don't, right? So I think they're well aware. So let me say some things about that. I think in the Bankers Association, there are probably quite stable jobs. And so, you know, banks are not letting go of the financial sector, is not letting go of people the way that other sectors in the economy are. But I'm going to have this conversation anyway, because all of us are living together in a society. And regardless of what our job is or our area of work is, it's important for us to also, as citizens, understand these issues, you know, outside of our own experience or field. So what's happening to women now in the context of the pandemic, and there will be some data being released on that in the next few months. What is happening with women is that, first of all, in the economy, women predominated in the lowest paid occupations. So prior to 2016, 2017, um, in jobs that earn $3,000 or less a month and $5,000 or less a month, women predominated. That means women were in the poorest paid, lowest paid, most insecure, non unionized, low status jobs, and possibly even insecure jobs in the economy. That does not count women who are working in the informal economy. And we know many women make ends meet in the informal economy. They make cakes, they sew clothes, they do catering, they do childcare. I mean, if you leave it to women, they do everything on the side. It's amazing to make ends meet, right? Women are working 2 and 3 jobs, not just because Caribbean women are resilient, but because Caribbean women have children to raise. And very often the responsibility falls on them to buy the school books, to buy the school shoes, to be able to provide both lunch and transportation, right? So in the course of the pandemic, we know that first of all, over the last 4 years, we know that there's been significant job loss. We know industries have closed. We know that the economy has contracted. We don't have the data on that because it hasn't been collected in a systematic way since about 2017. But we also know in the context of the pandemic that, for example, daycares have been closed for a year, so that all the women who were working in daycares have been out of a job. We know, and could only have been, paid part salaries for so long. We know that women in the retail sector, women selling food, women in clothing stores that may have closed down, women in shops, for example, in Trinity Mall near me, many stores have closed. Those were all jobs in which women were predominantly working, jobs that are gone, jobs that will likely not come back anytime soon because the economy is not bouncing back in the way it was. So what we know is that the pandemic, and although our national health response was obviously excellent in the sense that we are pretty safe in Trinidad and Tobago right now, it has had huge economic effects that we must take very seriously, because all of those families that were barely making ends meet before are probably not making ends meet now. So it's very likely that personal indebtedness has increased. It's very likelihood that there is greater family scarcity and therefore mental distress, and therefore, all kinds of other things may be happening. We even know that for those parents who were too poor to be able to access schooling, either through having a phone or access to data, that those children, and there are studies done in the US that show that for the amount of days that a child misses school, you can calculate the later loss in future earnings. And so we know that those 40 or more thousand children that have been out of school for the entire year and not adequately accessing school at all because their families are just too poor, we know that that is a generation that is going to be at the that is going to lose income ultimately and be at a lower end of the economic ladder. And we have a social and economic crisis that is coming. That is all of our business, whether we have the jobs, whether in secure income, because we live in one society and we can only put up so much burglar proofing and alarms against each other. Ultimately, we are living together and we are each other's keeper. In terms of women's lives, we also know just from small studies that we have done at the IGDS, small qualitative studies, that that women have not only experienced higher unemployment, but they have also been assigned greater care work in the home. That is, they have had to take responsibility for looking after the children who have not been in school for a year, and that has had implications for their capacity to go out and earn a livelihood as well. We also know that when women have to work and they don't have an adequate place to leave their children, and of course school provided that safe place to leave your child, that children are often left in very unsafe conditions. And unsafe conditions could be by your granny, your auntie, your uncle, conditions that seem very safe, but which in fact are not. And we know that from the high levels of child sexual abuse and incest that exist in our society. So you asked about the pandemic, you asked how women are coping. I just wanted to lay out those issues, that the economic issues are real, that women in our society, a vast portion of women are struggling to cope, not just single mothers, because in some families, men may have lost their jobs as well, because a lot of plants have closed, for example. People may also disappear under our radar because they're in precarious contract work, right? Or they've maintained their jobs, but their hours have been cut back. And so there's a lot going on in the economy that we need to pay attention to in terms of women's lives. And so what would I advise? First, I would advise that we be real with ourselves about these demands and challenges that women are facing and not expect them to be able to handle it well. These are complex conditions created by a global pandemic as well as by state policy decisions. When the state decided to close daycares, they put responsibility for those children back in women's hands. When the state decided to close schools, they put the responsibility for those children back in women's hands. And those policy decisions would have had direct implications for many women's lives, including their ability to earn a livelihood. And so, I want to say that while we like to say to women, listen, as an individual, you can cope much better, you can do this, you can do that. We always, and in my own work, we always want to hold the policy level accountable for whether or not it has anticipated and thought about the effects that it could have on some of the poorest families in our society, but definitely amongst women who still have the greater responsibility for care.
I like the point you discuss on this idea of women doing it all, and I am guilty because I've been fed that all my life. Melanie, I saw your question. Don't worry, we're gonna answer that in the last 50 minutes. And just reading that question has my anxiety. I'm just like, I agree with you. But anyways, going back to my question at hand, we have in our culture, and I grew up with a Trini dad and a Bajan mom, and both cultures are the same with the Caribbean of idea of I had it worse than you. So you're not even allowed to have a discussion about your mental health, what it means to be a woman in this day and age. Because back in my day, I had to take 2 buckets of water, 5 kilometers, when in my day, I did it in 2 kilometers. So I tend to see that translate in management styles. So when we have technology coming into a department and you have a manager who may have been there, 2 decades, but trying to figure out technology, and then they're like, no, I'm not gonna use this technology. This is ridiculous. I had it worse than this. If I do this, you could do this better. So in the context of the gender conversation, what advice would you give to that manager? Because I almost feel as if they're fighting against the inevitable, but because they're placed in that managerial role and that longevity is the reason why they're in the position, you then have young people and some mostly times young women in a position where it's just a difficult place to be in, and then you can't leave because you have children to feed.
Yeah, so it's really difficult for women. And actually, I really appreciate Melanie's question, and I hope we get to it. I think it's really difficult for young women to negotiate hierarchy. In the first place, they know that jobs are scarce. They know that if you have a job, you may want to hold on to it. They also know that Trinidad and Tobago is a very hierarchical society, and we don't like people stepping out of line. We're very much into a particular kind of respect that is ageist, that is respecting of seniority, and I think the world is changing, and even for myself as a mother, my 9-year-old knows stuff about technology that I don't even know that she knows, just from playing around with my phone. And I think for those of us, and I'll tell you a little story, and it's not just a gender question, right? But where there are young women who are coming in who may have excellent ideas, but who may be afraid of, of challenging or of expressing themselves in case it doesn't want to be heard, and that's so often the case. Um, just to tell you a little story, so in the institute we had a one of those retreats that you do. And we have a lot of young staff in their 20s. And we have to do some exercise where you're on Mars and you have to do these weird HR things that they make you do for team building. And you're on Mars and you have to choose a bunch of equipment, and then you have to make a bunch of decisions. And so, I asked everybody, in my team, what did you think? What did you think? What did you think? And then, we appeared to decide collectively. But because I was, the most senior person there as head, in a sense, I was hearing everybody, but in a sense, I was leading the decision making or the mediation amongst multiple perspectives. And because they were much younger, although they were suggesting, they weren't really gonna disagree with me if I say, well, okay, I hear you, but what about this? This seems like blah, 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 blah. Anyway, in the end, we died on Mars. And so I then, when we had to reflect on the exercise, said, you know what? I learned a real lesson, which is that the instincts of my 20-something-year-old staff were actually much better than mine. And they deflected to me because I was in a position of authority. And I, in a sense, gave myself greater credibility because I thought I had more experience and therefore was in a position of authority. But actually, they would have, if I had done what they said, they would have kept me alive. And, because I was operating in my own frameworks, whatever those were, I was blind to seeing that they had insights that were much better than mine and instincts that were much better than mine. And that taught me a real lesson, me even, that you could be 24, 32, 28, and you could actually have much better instincts about something than someone who's been in the field, because we have a lot of faith in ourselves sometimes over and above our competency because we've just put in so many years. And sometimes we also buy into an ageist notion of authority. And so I think, so that's just to tell you, just to honor the fact that I think young people, and not just young people, but younger staff, junior staff in an organization can in fact have the instincts for where, and the observations for where something should go. And I think that, in a changing environment where the young know, in a sense, are more connected to the shifts that are happening than some of the older persons, we have to take those very seriously. But what I would say is the best thing, this is the advice I would give to any young woman in any context, anywhere. You have to find mentors. The only reason that I was able to do as well as I have been able to do in life is because I had excellent mentors: Rhoda Reddock, Patricia Muhammad, Roberta Clark, Hazel Brown. These were women I called up like a million. I can't even tell you how many times, with some minuscule thing I didn't understand, or some question, or some wrong opinion. And they were like, no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh, okay, right. It's a good thing I didn't go on TV and say that. And so, I've been buffed up many times and called them for advice many times. And honestly, that is what has allowed me to survive for 20 years up to today. I don't make a move without getting advice from the women that I have been able to find to mentor me. And so if you can find women in a in an organization where you are, they don't even have to be the top women. They may just be women with more experience who are very kind, women who are invested in seeing young women do well. You don't need to have the most cutting edge, the most badass, the most, top of the line women. You do need to have women who you can go to and say, listen, I'm thinking about, applying, laterally for a job here. What do you think? I'm thinking about saying this to my boss. How should I say it? I'm thinking that I want to reach out to this other woman to also mentor me. Do you think she would be willing? You need that. Any young woman going into any space or organization or anything, find a few women who will agree to be your mentors. Women actually feel honored when someone asks them to be one young woman asked me to be her mentor, and I was like, oh my gosh, somebody wants me to be her mentor. Right. And to this day, right, I was like, oh, right, that touches me in my heart. And so that's my one overall message: find your older women who are mentors, and they may change over time, and you hold them close and you go to them for everything. And that will be your best strategy for advancing in an organization, protecting your reputation, defending your ideas, remembering that you're sane, negotiating toxic situations, and kind of assessing what your aspirations are in a way that you can achieve.
Growing up, mentor wasn't something that was discussed a lot, and I found that I only understood what that meant after working in an international company. I was lucky enough to experience that and realize there were programs for that. So I'm sure there's a great discussion to be had there as it relates to companies creating programs for that. But before we get there, guys, we are going to definitely answer Melanie's question. If you don't know what we're referring to, head over to the comments. We're going to answer that. In addition to that, we're going to address the F word. I know it's controversial. We're going to get there. So we're going to go on a quick break and come right back. Okay, you stuck around to find out what is this F word she's talking about. I'm talking about feminism. It is fascinating to see a lot of people actually physically have a reaction. They cringe at the word. I'm not sure why this massive cloud has gone over to this word, but I would like Dr. Hosein to just share with our audience what feminism means to her and maybe a little history about it, because I feel like she would be a subject matter expert, especially as it relates to the Caribbean.
So, feminism is the struggle to create a world in which we are not valued for whether or not we meet masculine or feminine ideals. We are valued because we are human beings and for who we are. That is what feminism is. Feminism is also a struggle to transform the injustices that exist: racism, classism, our destructive approach to the environment, to challenge violence, the way that it defines our world, and to create, movements for peace. Feminism is also the movement to defend the labor that goes on in the private sphere by both women and men, which remains uncounted in our labor statistics. It remains unvalued in terms of our GDP, and it remains invisible in terms of its value to our economy and our society. Feminism is a movement in which both women and men can participate because they are invested in dismantling those interlocking systems of injustice. Ultimately, feminism is the only movement in the world that has ever put women first. And that is why it is so demonized, because it is so threatening to patriarchy to say, actually, we are not here to address women as our women, the nation's women, mothers, sisters, daughters. We are not here to create a world in which women can raise families and practice those responsibilities as their primary responsibilities better. We are simply here to create a world in which women's needs and their lives and their desires can be defined by them and matter through legislation, through policy, and across social norms. We are here to create a world in which there is not unequal access to power and decision making, where the fact that women have been 30% of our parliament or less for all of history, and in which we do not consider that an absolute injustice, but treat it as unremarkable, as something that we don't even need to be talking about every day, to change that world so that the kinds of injustices that have become normal to us become seen for what they are, and in which we all are invested in changing it. Feminism has also led the movement to dismantle patriarchy, which is a world in which qualities that associate manhood with dominance and control and authority and power, and I'm not saying that's who men actually are, but a world in which those things, where violence is the most valued, which we can certainly see in the extent to which the world spends money on war, as opposed to the extent to which it spends money on care and welfare and daycares and families. And so it is a world we are envisioning a world in which patriarchy has been ended, the same as we want a world where there's no white supremacy, where class inequality doesn't exist in the ways that it does, and so on, where there is not disabled persons can participate in the world in the ways that they have a right to, and in the ways that, that the rest of us who don't have those kinds of considerations, so that they have an equal chance. And so in wanting to dismantle patriarchy, there is in fact a role for men. And that is because on the one hand, patriarchy benefits men, and it's very clear to us how it does. But on the other hand, it also harms men. And so were we not living in a patriarchy, we would not have the rates of gang violence that we do, because there would not be the associations between masculinity and violence that exist in the ways that they do. That we would not have men in prisons in the numbers that we do. We have to ask ourselves, why are men in prisons in the numbers that they are, and to understand the way that masculinity and how it's defined becomes a risk factor for them. We would not have the high rates of prostate cancer among men that we do, because homophobia stops men from looking after their health in the ways that they should. It's seen as feminine, and feminine is something that men are not supposed to be seen to be. We would not have boys being silent about child sexual abuse that they experience, because they're afraid of how their masculinity would be considered by others. And for men, having their masculinity affirmed is absolutely essential over and above everything else. We would not have a world in which, when men experience unemployment, they experience it as emasculating, right? right? Because when women experience unemployment, they don't experience it as an attack on their gender. Men do, because they have been defined as the breadwinners. We would have a world in which men would be considered nurturers as much as women, and would perform those care responsibilities as much as women, and be valued for doing so. And so feminism only has the demonized reputation that it does because it is a movement that has sought to challenge the status quo, and the status quo will always react in a way that makes people in a way to disempower that movement. It is the status quo. It wants to keep itself in place. And we've all been raised to be emotionally attached to it. We've all been socialized it. It feels natural and normal. And so something that challenges it feels as if it is challenging, the way the world should be. And we can accept some changes. We can accept maybe higher levels of women's political participation. We can accept there maybe should not be the killing of women at the rates there should be. But actually, women want much more. We want to be able to walk freely on the streets. We want, a society in which men are not in prisons, affecting their families and themselves in the ways that they currently are. We want a society in which boys are not bullied for appearing to be gay, whether or not they are, or for appearing to be effeminate. We want a world in which there are not boys' toys and girls' toys, because these are children, and children have a right to be human beings, not to be assigned some roles over others and then to be devalued or bullied or policed into fulfilling those roles over and above being good human beings. Men and women have more in common than we are different. We both want to be respected. We want to be loved. We want to be given the opportunities to thrive. We want to be parts of communities. And if we give into a battle of the sexes, which is a patriarchal framing in which everything becomes seen as a battle, not as a site for caring and connection and love and solidarity, if we give in to that, then we will always think that men are being bashed by feminism, which I mean, and I've spent 25 years in Caribbean feminism. I know Caribbean feminists from across the region. I've never heard any of them bash men. They have brothers, they have uncles, they have sons, they have colleagues across social justice movements. What we are is absolutely clear that we are against systems that create hierarchies between human beings on the basis of their race, their sex, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their ability or disability. We are absolutely and non-negotiably clear about that. And that is what feminism is. And that is what justice is. And that is what we should all be invested in. Now, let me just say something. I don't want you to think that feminism came from the United States, or it came in the 1960s, or that it was, brought in, by foreign influences. I mean, first of all, the whole of the Caribbean is a foreign influence, right? So that's a little hypocritical to choose some over others, but no problem. When I teach about Caribbean feminism, I go back to Ana Kaona. Ana Kaona was a 15th century Taino chief in Haiti who actually fought Columbus and Columbus's troops who were colonizing Haiti. And she was a leader. Her father and her brother were killed by the Spaniards. She was a military leader, a political leader, a chief. And when she was finally captured, they told her that she could agree to become a concubine, or she would be killed. She was 29 years old. She was a mother. She refused, and she was put to death. When we go back to Caribbean feminism, we go back to the long struggle against colonization and its impacts. We go back to the struggle of Indigenous women to honor their sovereignty over the region. We go back to the women in slavery, the men and women in slavery, the women in slavery who fought against an exploitative system. We go back to the system of indentureship, and the women who struggled, right, in protests as well as privately to end as well as to survive an exploitative system that exploited them not just on the basis of their labor, but their sexuality, their reproduction, their bodies, as well as their labor. And to see those struggles up till today, that struggle for reproductive rights, for the right of safe and legal termination, goes right back to women in slavery who wanted to be able to choose when and under what conditions they had children and practiced abortions because their sexuality was sold and exploited as part of that system, and they were not in control of their bodies, their labor, or their sexuality. When we go back to the issues of equal pay for equal work, we go back to indentureship and the struggle of Indian women who would be paid 10 cents for the same job that men would be paid 25 cents for. And it was unjust then and it is unjust now. And when we go back to challenging violence, we are going back to the very beginnings of the colonial project in which violence against women was absolutely constitutive of the building of our modern Caribbean society. And so the issues that Caribbean feminists are tackling today are long, old issues born out of the region, fought by all of our ancestors, men and women, and they are the struggles that the women who came before us would absolutely want us to continue today.
That point you made about us picking and choosing American, that sense of American culture, I'm going to make that note for future conversations because I love it. Because I see how many of us go to Amazon.com. Like, at the end of the day, it has always been the top 10 visited site in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, which means we are clearly participating in a culture. So we cannot pick and choose. Listen, that is gold. I am going. I'm going to have this conversation over and over again. So let's head over to Melanie's question, which I hold very
Sure.
dear to my heart because as an entrepreneur, I've been in many rooms where I was the only female and obviously assigned a specific type of behavior. So Melanie would like to know if you can talk about women who, having confidence to speak up or speak out, being associated with PMS or that time of the month. And we think it's a running joke. What advice would you give to people who think this is funny?
So, just to honor what Melanie is saying, it is a minefield to negotiate out there. And so we can give advice to women, but we have to understand that we are empowering women in a context that where there is significant backlash and where there is significant disciplining of women who are who are practicing the very qualities that we are suggesting they should. We want to empower women, but we are empowering women without honoring the fact that we are sending them out there in a world that does not necessarily appreciate their empowerment, or certainly wants it to happen in a very nice way, wants it to be dressed up and pretty and polite and everything else for it to be empowered. And so for me, we have to pay attention to the backlash, which is real, which happens interpersonally, institutionally, absolutely real. Even while, and not sell women the idea that because you are empowered as an individual rather than as a collective, that you can change movement. And that's why feminism is a collective movement, because we cannot just put the burden on individual women to change a system when that system is so resilient. And has so much power of all kinds. So just to say that I hear what Melanie is saying, I experience it all the time. In talking to you today, I can smile, I can be very accessible, I can be very gentle, I can be but if I came in and I was like, listen, to deal with the system, because like women are real fed up out here, right? And I said those things, right? If I said, well, every day is men's day, right, I would have a very different reaction. And so all of us, Melanie, are managing our righteous anger. We are managing our fear. We're managing our right to say the things that we deserve to say, but having to say it in nice ways that'll be heard by others. We are all managing those gender norms that require women to be seen as caring, more soft, not too masculine, not too aggressive, not like they're trying to take over, not like they're trying to be difficult. We are all of us negotiating those every day. And I think back to the great Caribbean tradition of masking. So I don't think about it necessarily as, me having to say things nicely that I'd rather be angry about, right? I think about the great Caribbean Anansi tradition, right? That you are saying things in a way that, you're playing multiple characters at once. And we all know that well. So that you may have, for example, I never owned a jacket, right? Because for me, jacket is Babylon. But when I became head of the institute, a senior woman said to me, you need to get a jacket, okay? So I went, I got my jacket. I wear my jacket, I go to meetings, I say, listen, I need funds for this in the institute, I wear my jacket, right? Right? And they say, okay. And I say, great. And I go and I take off my jacket and I go and do my anti-Babylon work, right? And so I'm just saying that so often we have to honor how much we have to mask up. We have to honor the fact that we have to do, we have to um, we have to perform particular ways. And I talk to my younger students and they're all super radical, right? And they're not going to undo that. And I was like, I was there. I was 23. I was there. More power to you, right? But when you are working in institutions, you have to navigate them in extremely sophisticated ways. And so for me, I have learned that to become very precise about my goal in a situation. So if my goal is to walk out with $50,000, I'm going to put on a jacket because my goal is not to represent my personal politics. My goal is to defend the work of the institute. And so sometimes we have to go in and be like, you know what, that man or that woman, he's going to react or she's going to react in a particular way, right? They have their issues and challenges. I don't have those. So I'm not going to misread what I'm doing. But you know what? I have a larger goal, which is to get X done. So I'm just going to go and mask up, right? I'm going to go and say this very nicely, right? I'm going to get what I want and I'm going to get out, right? Because they are not my battle today. My battle is what I'm trying to achieve. And sometimes that is the reality of women's lives in a patriarchy. We say women are manipulative, but how else do women survive in a system in which that is absolutely, in every sense, built against them? You have to be smart. You have to play the game. Women know that implicitly, and we put women down for it. But actually, that is a survival strategy and a very necessary one. And so I'm just saying to you, I get it, right? It is a struggle. And so we have to, there have been times I've wanted to write in the newspaper. So I'm often challenging Single Fathers Association because they say a lot of like very problematic things. And I've had people say to me, why are you getting angry about them in the press? Why don't you see, why are you challenging them? Why are you sounding so angry? Why can't you say things more nicely? And says to me, and I've had to say, listen, women have a right to their anger. We have a right to express our anger publicly. We don't always have to be nice. We don't always have to be playful, but we have to know what we're out there trying to get. Keep our eye on the prize. There are a lot of people who are not our battles, right? You just have to get around them, right? It's yin and yang, right? Sometimes you're going in like a stick fighter and sometimes you're going in like water. I just getting around you today, right? Because I have other things to do. So if you want me mask up and play this way, I'm masking up and playing this way, and I'm getting on with getting above you, right? At which point I have a larger goal in mind. And that is the reality. It is not a pretty reality. It is not a perfect reality. It is a highly messy reality, but it is the reality. We also need to have, I think, sensitization sessions in workplaces where workers and colleagues and managers can talk about these issues. They can talk about the fact that how women speak is judged more harshly than how men speak, that how women present is used to judge how intelligent they are, that we look at women to judge them far more than we listen to men. We look at women, that we expect women to abide by gender norms all the time, even when they have a right to trespass them, or even when they have a right to transform them. We say women must be more like men. They must work longer hours. They must be more dedicated to the workplace. They must not run away when they have childcare challenges. They must be focused when they're at work. So we want them to be more like men, but not too much, because only man should be like man. Right? So you must try to be like men, but you can never really, right, challenge that domain of being men, because then we will push you back for being too strong or too aggressive. And so women, have to both excel at masculine values and excel at feminine values simply to be themselves in the workplace. And so having, very explicit and real workplace conversations about how women have to negotiate simply being in the workplace, negotiating those gender norms, negotiating a greater lack of legitimacy, negotiating a greater lack of authority, and creating a more gender sensitive context to that, I think will help. Being in a room and saying, listen, I'm going to say this to this boss, can you amplify me? That was the strategy that Obama had, the women in Obama's circle had in the White House. They would amplify each other. So you have to know who your allies are, so that women are backing up each other around the table. And you also finally, I think, gender consciousness in workplaces, that women are going to be seen as either too emotional or too aggressive. It is very difficult for us to win in this world. And I think recognizing it's not just you. It is not just your difficulty to negotiate. You are not just the problem. This is something that women everywhere across every workplace share and have to negotiate. And so just want to honor that and tell you, negotiate as best as you can, use every strategy that you can, and be mercenary about where it is you want to go and what you want to achieve.
So Catherine is in the comments. You may have joined us a little late. Dr. Hosein did mention about the mask up and why it was necessary. For me, I can share a personal story. I was told I had to straighten my hair. My natural hair would not make it as a specific job, which is a customer front facing. I had the privilege of saying no, but not everybody has that privilege.
Absolutely.
You have to, if you have responsibilities, you do what you have to do to survive. So I just want to close.
But that's the intersection of sexism and racism, right? That's why the F word is not a bad word, because women experience that in ways men don't. That's why there are those intersections in feminism that highlight the connections also with race and race inequalities.
So I want to close off because
equality is a human right. What equality means is that regardless of whether or not you are biologically male or biologically female, you are both members of the human race. You are different sexes. One sex is not more valued or better or more of a standard than the other sex. There are multiple sexes in the human race, but that is a different conversation. So some persons are intersex, some persons change their sex, some persons' gender does not match their sex. But let me just say for now, in the context of men and women, there's biological difference. Those should not then become categories that signal unequal access to status, power, or value. Equality is based on the fact that women and men are just biologically different human beings, but are both human beings, and therefore should have equal access to all of the same rights, including right over their reproduction and their bodies. So men have right over their bodies, women do not, because they are female human beings, which is why terminations are not safe and legal in many countries in the world. Equality is a right, and it is also a responsibility of states and societies to recognize and to respect.
So I want to close off with something that has been popularized with social media, which is the Me Too movement. And I want to put it in the context of other women, because you mentioned mentorship, which, it's interesting because growing up, I was actually told, I was pitted against other women. Women don't like other women. She don't like you because you look good. And it was always a case of, vying for the attention of men.
So that is real. And I just want to say women are not perfect human beings. I want to say that both women and men are brought up in the same sexist and patriarchal and dysfunctional world. We are all brought up by sexist, racist, classist, and patriarchal beliefs. Women are brought up in a world in which they are placed in competition to each other for those few places of power, whether those few places of power are accessing men or accessing jobs. And so we have grown up being taught we have to compete with each other for the recognition by a highly masculine system, and also for recognition by those in power, which are men. And until women not only get in power, but in getting into power are committed to transforming our societies and creating a context in which we don't see each other in competition with each other, this is going to happen very often. So I don't want to idealize women, right? Women are dealing with a lot personally, interpersonally, a lot of self-esteem issues. Totally understand. Well, my 10-year-old is asking me, why do eyelashes matter? And I am feeling heartbroken that she is growing up in that this information has come to her, for her to always now look at herself in the mirror and wonder if she's good enough. And so women are constantly wondering if we're good enough. We experience a lot of self-esteem issues. We experience ourselves in competition with others. There are scarce resources available to us to access power and privilege, and we are brought up being pitted against each other. And that is why feminism, as the only movement that did not pit women against each other and that emphasized women working together, was seen as such a threat and is so demonized, because it is precisely working against that very idea that women are each other's competition and put each other down. It is the one movement of women working in solidarity with each other over and above anything else. And doesn't it make sense that it would be seen as so threatening that it would be demonized, that it's even considered, we can't even say it, right? And that's why women should be feminists, because it is the fearless movement for women to be each other's allies. It don't even matter if you like each other, right? You are committed to being allies. You're committed to a larger cause for women. But keeping in mind that we also, once we begin to connect with each other, we realize we have plenty issues that we are managing that then lead to dysfunctions in our relationships with each other. That I'm not saying to excuse them. I'm just saying that we shouldn't think about women as each other's, as our own worst enemies, because women are not our own worst enemies, because we are not the ones killing women, right? The people who are killing women are the real ones who are the threat to women. What's going on with women is that we need to figure out how to be in allyship with each other, how to not be threatened by each other, and how to be feminist in a collective way with each other that can transform the system in which we find ourselves, but which we ourselves do not define.
Thank you so much. I think that is that is the best note for us to end this session today.
Thank you so
Thanks
much for
again.
having me and giving me this opportunity to talk with you all.
Great. So, if you want to find Dr. Hosein, you could actually Google her name with Newsday. She has an article with some great content for us to learn, because that's what this really is about, right? We want to be able to go beyond what our parents may have instilled in us. I am a product of change, because I was told, in a sense, that this is not going to happen, women are not for you. But then I'm only here because of women, through sports, and as an entrepreneur, I've been supported by women. So I hope this inspires you to ask questions, drive change, and maybe turn around and help a hand to somebody who needs it. Thanks again for joining us this session. Make sure to sanitize and mask up, and I'll see you on the next live session of Straight Off the Bat.